Welcome viewers to 284 Media's special report. I am Kamal Haynes. Well, the ongoing trade war between the United States and key global partners, Mexico, Canada, and China, has dominated international headlines, sparking concerns about economic ripple effects across the world. But what does this mean for the British Virgin Islands? As a territory that imports approximately 90% of its goods, most of which comes from the United States, should residents be concerned about rising costs, supply chain disruptions, or potential shortages? To gain a clearer understanding of how this geopolitical tug-of-war could impact our territory, I sat down with three key individuals: Chief Executive Officer of MHV Group of Companies, Henry Cricky, Managing Director of Rotong Wholesales, Neil Hayes, and the BVI's Special Envoy to the Premier, Mr. Benito Wheatley. But these experts, representing the private sector and government, shared valuable insights on whether the BVI should brace for economic turbulence or if, at this stage, there's no immediate cause for alarm. The consensus: there's no need to panic, at least not yet. But as global trade tensions evolve, the BVI must remain vigilant and prepare for any potential fallout. Well, join me as we break down the realities of this trade war and what it could mean for the territory in the months and years ahead. We get to all those details after a word from our sponsors.
Attention Anegada residents! Attention Anegada residents! CCT is coming to you! That's right! CCT will be visiting Anegada every third Wednesday of the month. Need to pay your bill? Sign up for a new service? Or have a customer service concern? CCT has got you covered! No need to leave the island. CCT is here to make staying connected easier than ever. Mark your calendars for every third Wednesday starting October 16th and visit us for all your CCT service needs. For more information, call us at 444-4444 or follow us on any of our social media pages. See you soon, Anegada!
Welcome back, viewers. As promised, to my right, your left, we have joining us Managing Director of Rotong Wholesales, Mr. Neil Hayes. Thank you so much, Mr. Hayes, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us to speak on this very important topic as it relates to, the U.S. trade wars with countries such as, at least at this present moment, Mexico, Canada, and China. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Obviously, it's important in terms of when it comes to topics of this magnitude to speak to stakeholders involved, and none better to speak to than Rotong Wholesales, obviously, in terms of your footprint in the BVI as it relates to supplying residents with needed goods on a daily basis. And as we would have seen following the announcement from US President Donald Trump as it pertains to the tariffs that he plans to impose on Mexico and Canada. However, in terms of China, he maintained that 10% tariff. From a perspective as it pertains to a wholesale company such as Rotong Wholesales, what implications could that have as it pertains to BVI, if any at all?
Yeah, it's an important topic, and I know a lot of people are talking about it, and I know there's conversation in the USVI as well for good reason too. I know there was a big conversation at the weekend about saltfish from Canada in the USVI, and I can understand people's concern. I think the first thing I'd say is, with my experience in importing things here, is don't panic. I wouldn't see any great cause for concern, and whilst I'm not an economist and I can't predict what the outcome of these negotiations will be, I think there's a number of potential impacts, but there's also a number of things that we can do to mitigate against that. So I think the sort of initial thing I would say to people is certainly don't panic. It's certainly very, very early days. There's a few potential outcomes. So one potential outcome which is being talked about a lot in the US is obviously shortages, so reduction in supply of products, particularly commodity items, things that typically come, fruit and vegetables. You get a lot of fruit and vegetables from Canada and from Mexico, so that could have a bearing on us. All of that said, it's not that there'd be an immediate shortage, right? It's going to affect certain items seasonally. What that probably means is that, wherever there's a shortage, prices would go up a little bit. So there's likely to be some inflation if there were to be some shortages on those items. So there's a lot of ifs, is my point, before you get to the outcome of potential inflation. And that's why I'd sort of say don't panic. Some other key things, we get 90% of our imports from the US. So, most of the food and beverage that we're bringing to the island is coming from Port of Palm Beach. So it's typically from, US suppliers. Of course, many of those are using Canada and Mexico for either raw materials or for finished goods. But that in my mind would happen quite gradually. I've seen, for example, if you cast your minds back to COVID, we saw some situations where there were really significant shortages because factories were closed, really extreme situations where some suppliers turned off their export market to protect the domestic market. So again, theoretically that's possible, that could happen. Again, there's a lot to go before we get to that stage. And I mean, just for the record now, we haven't had a single supplier even give us a kind of heads up or a warning that might happen, which to me indicates it's still very, very early and quite sort of low probability. We can get good value supply from Europe, from France, from Holland, from Germany, from the UK. I mean, if you look at the Waitrose product that we carry from the Waitrose supermarket chain in the UK, we can get good supply. The challenge typically isn't even so much about cost, it's more just about the lead time and the ease of managing that, trying to forecast and order something that's on the water for 4 weeks versus a week. It's much easier to use the US for those reasons. And there's also probably a greater bias towards US brands here for good reason. But if it came to it, absolutely we could switch some supply to Europe or to other locations.
Hayes explained the origin of products sourced from Mexico and Canada, the two main countries currently with a potential 25% tariff hanging over their heads.
It's really hard to give a precise answer to that because you've got a combination of raw materials that go into making up products in the US, so it really depends how you want to answer it. If you looked at fruit and vegetables, it's seasonal. So you might get carrots from Mexico in one season and then from California in another, and so on and so on. So that's going to vary a little bit based on the season. I think it's fair to conclude that if people in the US are concerned about reduction in supply from Canada and Mexico, then as a byproduct of that we should be, and therefore it's right to be concerned. But equally, I wouldn't panic because there's a lot of road to travel down before we get to that. I think it's also worth mentioning that we source product directly from Canada. So, if you take the saltfish example, saltfish in our case, the type of saltfish we import comes from Canada. So we essentially bypass that whole situation anyway. If you're in the USVI, and hence the concern in, I think, St. Thomas at the weekend was, well, hey, what's going to happen with saltfish supply, and saltfish pricing, given that comes from Canada into essentially a US territory. So, on that particular instance, we're quite lucky. Equally, you've got major brands like Robin Hood flour comes directly from Canada. A lot of our milk, Distinction milk, comes from Europe. So these things are not coming through the US. They're not dependent on the US. But like I say, 90% is, and that's a lot to work with. But I think it's hard to forecast what's going to happen. I just think there's a lot of road to travel down, and therefore I certainly wouldn't panic at this stage. And I have a hard time picturing it being a worse situation than COVID, where you quite literally had factories closed that could cease to operate, and therefore we simply couldn't get product at all because they just weren't being produced at that point in time.
If the United States proceeds with tariffs on Mexico and Canada, how long before the BVI starts to feel the impact? Hayes shared a worst-case scenario.
I think it's worth saying that we carry typically about 5 weeks worth of inventory stock on our island, right? So, we have a huge amount of warehousing. People are familiar with Paseo Estate, the amount of warehousing that we have. We're bringing in often full containers of product or full containers of mixed product. So we have sort of 5 weeks worth of cover. I think most people are aware as well, when we get to hurricane season, we tend to really increase that depth of stock cover, as we would call it, particularly on things like water, you know, where often we'll carry 12 weeks of water supply just in case of, you know, emergency. So, you know, we've already got a buffer in terms of what might happen, you know, and that isn't spread equally across every single product, but we've already got a pretty healthy buffer. You know, that costs us money because we have to invest in holding that stock and we have to invest in warehousing, but it's an important part of what we do here. So we have a buffer there. Equally, we have some protection in terms of our broader supply chain. So being part of a slightly larger group, you know, we have agreements, you know, with suppliers that are group agreements across, you know, our parent company, which gives us a bit more leverage than necessarily being just a small single independent. That's really helpful. Just gives that little bit more leverage when we're talking about maintaining supply. So, you know, to answer the question, it would vary depending on the item, depending on the potential shortage, if there was one. You know, it may just be that there's no shortage and there's just inflation. You know, that's going to vary upon the commodity.
He also broke down the standard pricing strategy used by Rotong Wholesales when adjusting for inflation and increased import costs.
Fundamentally, we come from a position of not wanting to, you know, inflate prices unnecessarily, because we see and we analyse this where there is necessary inflation in products, we see the volume decrease. So, you know, that's the flip side of it, you know, and everybody thinks, oh, you push your prices up, you know, good for you. Well, that's not always the case, because often we'll see that volume decrease and therefore we end up making less money. So generally as a retailer, it's a little bit contrary to what I think the public often think. We are not, you know, we're not happy about inflating prices, because invariably that will have a negative impact on volume, which isn't good for us. Now, in terms of the practice, typically, you know, when we order goods, we have an agreed cost price. Some of those things are on a contract, some of those things, so the price is set for a year. Some of those things, the price might be variable in terms of cost price. We calculate the landed cost when it arrives on island. And that's really the trigger for us to examine what our retail price is. So, you know, if there was a freight increase, we would need to reflect that in the cost, you know, which has happened. We saw that in COVID with, you know, freight and transport increases. We saw it with huge increases in port fees from the Port Authority, which again, we had to pass on, you know, in retail prices. So, you know, the trigger is when you land the product. We wouldn't retrospectively go back and reprice stock that we already have. So, you know, I think it's just important that, you know, to know that it's not in our best interest to see inflation in the market. You know, we try to manage inflation, smooth things as best as we can, and that's why on a lot of our supply agreements we will typically have forward supply agreements where we can fix the price to give us some level of stability and predictability in terms of pricing.
Orange alert! Orange alert!
Fire is spreading across the BVI. The fastest, most reliable, and affordable fiber internet service is here for you. Look out for Fire in these new locations: Slaney, Duff Bottom, Manual Reef, Seacouse Bay, Albion, Hannah's, Palestina, Pleasant Valley, and Havers. Fiber is in your area. Call 444-4444 or visit a CCT store to find out more and bring it home. More locations coming soon.
Today, I am doing Kamal treatments with Beyond the Reef. Today, we are doing shark research. So today, we are doing whale research with Beyond the Reef. And wherever I go, I take CCT with me because my life is unlimited.
Welcome back, viewers, to 284 Media. But as we continue this very important discussion, I also had the pleasure of speaking with the Chief Executive Officer of MHV Group of Companies, Mr. Henry Cricky, who at the time of our interview was off island. Well, he too reassured residents that at this stage, there's no need to worry.
First and foremost, we should not panic at this time. We have discussed it within our group with our chairman and our directors, and it's very early in this situation, and we don't see a need to panic at all at this time. As you correctly mentioned, President Trump announced the tariffs, and the same day that they were supposed to go into effect, by the end of that day, both Canada and Mexico tariffs had been postponed by 30 days while they negotiate further. So it is still very early in this situation for persons to react in any major way. We don't know if the threat was more of a negotiating tactic, and if it will happen, and even if it does happen, how much it will affect goods coming to the BVI in particular, because as you know, not all the goods that come out of the US into the BVI are from Canada and Mexico. So there are a lot of different factors that are still developing in the matter. And we certainly think, and our suppliers haven't indicated to us, that there is any need to really, to panic, as you said, at this time at all.
Cricky provided insight into key grocery imports from Mexico, Canada, and the United States, emphasizing that at least from Walmart superstores, food items are not sourced from China.
So from Mexico in particular, you tend to get a fair amount of tomatoes, avocados, onions, beef and pork products. But you also get a lot of those same products out of the US, for example, onions and tomatoes in particular, and other produce, and from other nations. Similarly, from Canada, not a whole lot of produce, but you do get some meat products. For example, some beef and some other processed products. So those are the main products that I would keep an eye on if anything happens. And of course, there are other products that come from those, but they are not the only places where our suppliers will get those goods from. A lot of them, as I said, you have pretty big farm works and so on in the US and other countries in Caribbean and Latin America that produce a lot of those goods.
Okay, and in terms of, as you would have mentioned, the option of having other suppliers in other countries and nations that could somewhat cushion the effects of these tariffs should they be implemented and enforced by the United States of America. I want you to just shed more light on that as well, because that in itself is an avenue that could help reduce inflation as it relates to the British Virgin Islands should Donald Trump proceed with his decision to implement these tariffs come the next 30 days after the that grace period has completed.
Right. So I would give an example. I don't know if you remember, a couple of years ago, we had a surge in the prices of chicken wings. So we were having a difficult time getting chicken wings into the country from the US at a reasonable price. And we were able to source our wings, a good amount of our wings, from some countries in South America and Latin America. The delivery time was somewhat longer, so in that way it was not optimal, but at least we were able to avoid some of that increase in cost to us as a business, to consumers, and to restaurants as well, which would pass on that cost to others.
He also pointed out a potential advantage for the BVI, an increase in the purchasing power of the US dollar following the trade war announcement, which could benefit imports from Canada and Mexico.
You noticed when the US announced the trade wars that the Canadian dollar decreased significantly, for example, and so did the Mexican peso. So what that caused in effect is the dollar to be stronger and give you increased buying power in those countries. So in some ways, the changes even in the currency also help to offset some of the potential raises in tariffs. So there are so many different factors at play that to panic prematurely would be unwise in our view.
And you would have just touched on a part or an aspect that I believe most persons ordinarily would overlook. You spoke on the fact that, you know, these tariffs and the conversations as it pertains to the trade war affected the spending power from the U.S. perspective, increased the spending power, but in terms of from a local perspective, when you look at the Canada economy and the Mexican economy, how it impacted that, which also gives us more bang for our dollar as it pertains to our purchasing power. Ordinarily, in a situation like that, I'm sure obviously you as the CEO would obviously have, you know, you're the person directly in contact with the suppliers, you're your directors, etc. How in terms of a scenario where that happens, how quick would that reflect, let's say, on items here in the British Virgin Islands? Let's say, for example, just giving a raw figure out there, let's say, for example, you spend $100 on oranges, and that price has then since been converted to, let's say, the $19 for those oranges. And in an ideal sense, because you don't know, there are other factors like shipping, etc., that may increase or will fluctuate. But let's say ideally the cost of shipping, etc., remains the same. How quick would that be reflected on the products on the shelf to then benefit the consumers in a scenario like that?
Typically, I would say that within about a month, because you have to realize that the products have to be purchased in the US from wherever they're importing it from, and then they have to receive them, and then they have to be shipped again to us. So I would say maybe, and by the time we get it and then put it on our shelves and price it, I would say maybe 3 weeks to a month before you see that kind of change, those kind of changes. But it's honestly impossible to gauge, like, to have any one item in isolation, because let's say, for example, on the analogy that you used, we would have, because we use the US dollar, we have increased buying power. So let's say, for example, that the Canadian currency stayed weaker and we are importing some goods from Canada. Remember, Canada also supplies a lot of fuel to the world economy through the pipelines to the US and so on. So you never know how it could affect fuel prices, what they might do with fuel prices and other countries that have a say in fuel prices. So as you mentioned, shipping could change. So there's so many things that can change. You don't know. You can't just say one factor might cause prices to go up or down immediately. But I would say, to answer your question, within about 3 weeks to a month is when you see slight changes. You might see changes or effects of changes in the world, maybe reflected in groceries. And the change might be small because, for example, if we buy tomatoes or onions or avocados from a supplier in Florida, they might get maybe 20%, just to call a number, from Canada or Mexico, for example. And so it's a very small percentage. So every situation is just so specific. But I would say this, that in the BVI, the market is we have quite a few good sized grocery stores in the BVI, and it's pretty competitive. And you do find that when one lowers, the others tend to compete.
Using a worst case scenario, we asked Creaky how long it would take for the BVI to feel the economic effects if the United States move forward with tariffs.
One of the things too you can think about, Kamal, the way I see it as well, is remember that if President Trump fully engages in this trade war with Canada, Mexico, and China. But China isn't so much involved in groceries for us. That's why we're not mentioning China so much. But if he does, it will significantly affect consumers in the U.S. And, I don't think his intention is to adversely affect consumers in the U.S. in a big way, negatively. And so if by chance, he tries to take this war to the extreme, as you were saying, and it affects consumers in the U.S. in a very big way, I don't think that's what he desires. I know it's not what the consumers will desire. So, you have to consider all of those things. But if it does happen, as you said, just worst case scenario, I would say within a month to a couple of months, you could start seeing very changes. But as I mentioned, the items, it depends. It's very specific on the items. And there are other options out there as well. And a part of the reason that President Trump says he's doing it is to have more jobs in the U.S. Perhaps farming for those items in particular may increase in the states or the counties where those are. For example, you have several places. I go to Vidalia onions. That's from a place, I think, in Georgia, very popular onions. And perhaps they will give incentives in those areas to produce more onions to offset the increase. So there are just so many factors at play that we have to. I believe we're doing the right thing. We're doing the right thing by being vigilant. Definitely doing the right thing by being vigilant. But we have to monitor it, monitor the situation step by step. There's so many things that can happen and not panic at all.
Just give me my service. Yeah. Just give me my service. Just give me my service.
Make the switch to CCT and get connected today. Unlimited talk, text, and data. Visit any CCT store or call us at 444-4444. CCT, Life Unlimited.
At Higher BVI, we're not just about business. We're about empowering lives, and that is because we aspire to inspire. By choosing us, you're supporting a company that believes in equal opportunities, diversity, and community growth. Our mission goes beyond profit. It's about providing HR solutions, fostering talent, and leaving a positive impact. Join us in building a better future, a better BVI. Choose Higher BVI, where your support isn't just a transaction, it's a transformation. Together, we're changing lives in these beautiful Virgin Islands.
Welcome back, viewers, to 284 Media's special report. Well, last but certainly not least, all the way from Washington, D.C., Special Envoy to the Premier, Mr. Benito Wheatley, who provided us with a national perspective of the U.S. tariffs' impact on the British Virgin Islands.
Tariffs are a concern, generally speaking, when they're very high, when their effects will cause prices on businesses and consumers. And in fact, this is what we expect would happen if the Trump tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and those already in place on China go through. The current proposal is for 25% tariffs on Mexico, 25% tariffs on Canada, 10% tariffs on Canadian energy, and 10% tariffs on China. Now, the initial effects of this will be on the U.S. Because the U.S. consumer is who will pay for that extra tax on goods being imported into the U.S. because businesses will pass on the increases to consumers. Some of the estimates that have come out are that it will cost each U.S. household probably $1,000 to $1,200 more a year in spending. And that is a problem for us in two ways. We import most of our goods from the U.S., not only the supermarkets, but also the construction companies, a number of the wholesalers, those who are selling lumber, construction goods. All of these things will be affected. That means that construction costs for individuals could go up. It means that food that we import and buy in the supermarkets could be higher. You just look at the amount of vegetables that are imported into the U.S. from Mexico. 2/3, that's very high. We then import them to the BVI from the U.S. You look at vehicles. We import many of our vehicles from the U.S. There will be costs to our people if the tariffs go through. Now, the Chinese tariffs are already in place, and we know that China, we get lots of things like phones and other things that come from there. So electronic goods, industrial goods, those things, the prices are going to go up, undoubtedly. But there are negotiations at the moment between the US, Canada, and Mexico on the proposed tariffs. So they are on pause. So we have to see what the outcome will be. But I anticipate we will still see some higher tariff on those countries.
One critical concern raised by Wheatley is the United States imposing a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium, which directly impacts the construction industry. With the BVI still in recovery from Hurricanes Irma and Maria, he said this could slow rebuilding efforts and increase costs.
Now, just one point, Canadian lumber, very important to construction in the U.S., construction in the BVI. And so certainly something that's going to affect us. But the negotiations between Canada, the US, and Mexico are still ongoing. So we don't actually know what the outcome will be. So no one should panic at this time. We have to wait to see what the negotiations produce. And they were supposed to be over the course of 30 days. So let's see what the outcome will be.
Wheatley also highlighted the importance of regional integration through CARICOM, arguing that the BVI must reduce its reliance on US imports by strengthening trade ties with the Caribbean.
Caribbean's import bill is huge. We import billions and billions of dollars worth of goods from the US, some from other partners, but mainly the US. And during COVID, we saw how vulnerable we were in the region. If the US has to use its own agricultural and other goods and so goods for itself, then we are at a disadvantage and at risk. So CARICOM, during the pandemic, they pledged to improve food security across the region. And what that means is that within the various CARICOM countries, there has to be a greater effort to produce our own food. But that's not enough because some of us are very small, don't have the same agricultural lands to produce agricultural goods as others. So there has to be more intra-Caribbean trade. We have to have more trade among ourselves, which means that we have to lower trade barriers and buy from each other. That will not only lower the huge perhaps import bill from the US, but it will make the region wealthier because we will save and be spending money with each other. The other aspect of this is that there is the option to produce much healthier food in our own region. If we are the ones producing it, we can control, whether it's GMO, genetically modified food, or whether it can be organic. So it provides us with a good opportunity to control the quality of our food, which impacts the health of our people. But the key to trying to manage through these international trade wars, all of these changes, is for us to diversify our suppliers, our supply chains. We can't rely on just one trade partner. We have to have several so that we are less vulnerable to the actions of one country. If one country decides to impose tariffs, we then can pivot to another one to get the very same goods at a cheaper price and keep prices stable at home.
Well, while the United States trade war with Mexico, Canada, and China continues to unfold, the BVI remains in a stable position, at least for now. Our discussions with industry leaders and government officials make it clear that at this stage, there's no immediate threat to our supply chain or costs of goods. However, as global trade policies shift, it is crucial that we stay informed and prepared for any potential changes that could trickle down to our shores. But the BVI's reliance on imports means that even the smallest disruptions in international trade could have an impact on our economy. That's why ongoing dialogue between government officials, business leaders, and consumers will be key in navigating whatever challenges may come. As always, 284 Media will continue to monitor this developing situation and bring you the latest updates as they arise. Well, thank you for watching this episode of Special Reports. I'm Kamal Haynes, and I'll see you next time.